The crystal chandeliers sparkled like diamonds in the ballroom of the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. Every surface seemed to shimmer with gold and silver decorations. Elizabeth Morgan stood at the entrance, clutching her simple black purse against her navy dress. She felt like a fish out of water. Her dress had cost her $35 at a clearance sale last spring. She'd thought it looked nice enough when she bought it, but now, surrounded by women in designer gowns that probably cost more than her car, she felt terribly out of place. The other ladies glided past her in silk and satin, their jewelry catching the light with every movement. Elizabeth was 58 years old and had worked as a librarian in the small town of Millbrook for the past 30 years. She loved her job, helping children discover the magic of books and assisting elderly folks with their research. Her life was simple, quiet, and exactly how she liked it. The invitation to the Children's Hope Foundation Gala had arrived in her mailbox 3 weeks ago. At first, she thought it was a mistake. Why would they invite her to such a fancy event? Then she realized they must have confused her with Elizabeth Morgan Rothschild, the famous socialite who often appeared in society magazines. She had called the foundation to explain the mix-up, but the young man on the phone had been so enthusiastic about her attendance that she couldn't bring herself to correct him. "We're so honored you'll be joining us, Ms. Morgan," he had said. "Your presence will mean so much to the cause." Elizabeth had always believed in helping children. She'd been saving money all year, setting aside a little from each paycheck. She had managed to save $500, which she planned to donate tonight. It wasn't much compared to what others might give, but it was what she could afford. As she stepped into the ballroom, she heard whispers following her like a shadow. 2 women in glittering gowns leaned toward each other, not bothering to lower their voices. "Who is that?" one asked, her diamond necklace catching the light. "I have no idea," her friend replied. "Look at that dress. Did she get lost on her way to a church potluck?" Elizabeth pretended not to hear them. She'd faced worse in her life. She walked with her head held high, looking for a place to sit. The room was filled with round tables covered in white linen, each centerpiece more elaborate than the last. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved gracefully between the guests, offering champagne and tiny appetizers that looked too beautiful to eat. She found an empty chair at a table near the back and sat down quietly. The other guests at her table glanced at her briefly, then continued their conversations as if she weren't there. They talked about their vacation homes, their children's private schools, and their latest shopping trips to Paris and Milan. Elizabeth sipped her water and observed the room. Everyone seemed to know each other. They air-kissed and laughed in that particular way that wealthy people do, not too loud, not too genuine. She noticed how they held their champagne glasses, how they picked at their food without really eating, how they constantly checked their phones even while talking to others. A waiter approached her table with a tray of champagne. "Would you care for some champagne, madam?" he asked politely. "No, thank you," Elizabeth smiled. "Water is fine for me." The waiter nodded respectfully, but she caught the slight raise of his eyebrow. Even he could tell she didn't belong here. Elizabeth touched the envelope in her purse containing her donation check. She reminded herself why she was here. It wasn't about the fancy clothes or the expensive champagne. It was about helping children who needed medical research to save their lives. That's what mattered. As more guests arrived, the whispers about her grew louder. People weren't even trying to be discreet anymore. Elizabeth heard words like lost, wrong address, and how did she get in, floating across the room. But she sat quietly, waiting for the evening to truly begin, holding onto her dignity like a shield against their judgment. The evening was in full swing when 3 women caught Elizabeth's attention. They moved through the crowd like queens, their designer gowns flowing behind them. These were the kind of women who appeared on magazine covers and hosted charity lunches that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Victoria Ashford led the group. Her platinum blonde hair was styled to perfection, and her red designer gown probably cost more than Elizabeth's yearly salary. Behind her walked Penelope Sterling, dripping in diamonds, and Charlotte Bancroft, whose family name was plastered on half the buildings in the city. Elizabeth tried to make herself small at her table, but it was too late. Victoria's sharp eyes had already spotted her. "Oh my goodness," Victoria said loudly enough for half the room to hear. "Is that woman wearing a department store dress to our gala?" She didn't even try to whisper. Penelope giggled behind her perfectly manicured hand. I think I saw that same dress on sale last year, for $30. Charlotte joined in. Maybe she thought this was a different kind of charity event, the kind where we donate clothes to the less fortunate. The women's laughter rang out like breaking glass. Elizabeth felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her eyes on her water glass. She'd dealt with bullies before, though usually they were children arguing over library books, not grown women in designer clothes. Throughout dinner, the three women continued their performance. They walked past Elizabeth's table repeatedly, making comments just loud enough for her to hear. I wonder if she knows which fork to use, Penelope stage whispered. Probably not, Victoria replied. Look, she's only eating the bread. She must be saving the real food to take home in her purse. Elizabeth continued eating quietly, using the correct utensils despite their assumptions. Her mother had taught her proper table manners long ago, though she doubted these women would believe that. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth needed to use the powder room. She stood up carefully and made her way across the ballroom. The venue was like a maze, and she accidentally bumped into someone near the dessert table. Oh no, I'm so sorry, Elizabeth said, turning to see Victoria Ashford staring at her with horror. My dress! Victoria shrieked. You've ruined my dress. Elizabeth looked down. There wasn't a mark on the red gown, not even a wrinkle, but Victoria was making a scene worthy of Broadway. This is a $50,000 Dior original, Victoria continued, her voice rising. And you've completely destroyed it with your clumsiness. People began to gather around them. Elizabeth felt trapped in a circle of staring eyes and judging faces. I don't see any damage, Elizabeth said quietly. But I apologize for bumping into you. Don't see any damage. Victoria's voice dripped with fake sweetness. Of course you wouldn't. You probably think this is just another dress from the clearance rack. Penelope stepped forward. Victoria, darling, you'll need professional cleaning. The best dry cleaner in the city. Which will cost a fortune, Charlotte added. Perhaps our friend here should pay for it, though I doubt she could afford it. The crowd murmured in agreement. Someone whispered, how did she even get in here? Elizabeth reached into her purse. I have $40. Will that help with the cleaning? The room erupted in laughter. Victoria looked at the money like it was something dirty. $40, she scoffed. My dear, the consultation alone costs more than that. Elizabeth put her money away, her hands steady despite the humiliation. I'm truly sorry for the accident, she said with dignity. Perhaps we could discuss this after the event. Victoria waved her hand dismissively. Just go back to your table. And try not to bump into anyone else. We can't all afford to replace our entire wardrobes. As Elizabeth walked back to her seat, she heard the whispers following her. Who invited her? She clearly doesn't belong here. This is what happens when they don't check the guest list properly. Elizabeth sat down at her table, her back straight and her head high. She touched the envelope in her purse again, reminding herself why she was here. The children who needed help didn't care about designer dresses or social status. They needed research, medicine, and hope. And that's exactly what Elizabeth planned to give them, no matter what these women thought of her. As the cruel laughter continued to echo around her, Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment. The sound transported her back 20 years, to a small hospital room where her world had changed forever. Nobody in this glittering ballroom knew her story. They saw only a plainly dressed woman who seemed out of place among their designer gowns and expensive jewelry. They didn't know about the little girl with golden curls who had once called her Mummy. Elizabeth's daughter had been just 8 years old when she was diagnosed with Pearson's syndrome, a rare genetic disorder that affects the body's energy production. The doctors had been honest from the start. There was no cure, and very little research existed because the disease was so rare. Elizabeth and her husband Thomas had spent every penny they had on treatments, traveling to specialists across the country. They sold their house, moved into a tiny apartment, and Thomas worked 3 jobs while Elizabeth stayed with their daughter in the hospital. But love couldn't stop the disease. Their beautiful little girl had slipped away on a rainy Tuesday morning, holding Elizabeth's hand and asking her to read just one more story. Thomas never recovered from the loss. 6 months later, Elizabeth found herself completely alone in the world, working as a librarian to make ends meet. She poured her grief into helping other children discover the joy of reading, seeing her daughter's smile in every child who checked out their first chapter book. What the society ladies gossiping about her didn't know was that Thomas had been more than just a loving father. He'd been a brilliant software engineer with several patents to his name. Before their daughter got sick, he'd been developing new technology for medical data processing. After his death, Elizabeth had put his patents in a drawer and forgotten about them. She couldn't bear to look at anything that reminded her of their dreams for the future. For 15 years, those papers gathered dust while she lived her quiet life among books and library cards. Then, 6 months ago, a lawyer had knocked on her door. A major tech corporation wanted to buy Thomas's patents. They were outdated by modern standards, but contained innovative ideas that could be developed further. Elizabeth had nearly said no. But then she thought about other families facing the same heartbreak she'd experienced. She thought about children with rare diseases, waiting for research that might never come because there wasn't enough funding. She signed the papers. The check they gave her had so many zeros that she had to count them twice. $200 million. More money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. The first thing Elizabeth did was cry. The second thing was to make a cup of tea. The third was to decide that her life wouldn't change. She didn't need a mansion or fancy cars. She loved her small house with its garden full of roses. She loved her old car that still ran perfectly fine. She loved her job at the library. But she knew exactly what to do with the money. She would use it to make sure other parents didn't have to watch their children fade away while doctors shrugged and said there wasn't enough research funding. That's why she had kept the invitation to tonight's gala, even after realizing it was meant for someone else. The Children's Hope Foundation was one of the few organizations funding research into rare childhood diseases. They had started a new program specifically for conditions like Pearson's syndrome. Elizabeth opened her eyes and looked around the ballroom. Victoria was still holding court, telling anyone who would listen about her ruined dress. Penelope and Charlotte were giggling behind their champagne glasses, throwing glances her way. They had no idea that the woman they were mocking had more money in her bank account than everyone at their table combined. They didn't know that she had chosen to keep wearing department store dresses and driving her old car because material things had never brought her happiness. Elizabeth smiled quietly to herself. Soon enough, they would all learn that true wealth isn't measured by the labels in your closet or the car in your driveway. It's measured by what you do with what you have and how you help others along the way. The night was still young, and Elizabeth had a surprise planned that would change everything. The lights in the ballroom dimmed slightly as a tall man in a perfectly tailored tuxedo stepped onto the stage. This was James Whitmore, the famous auctioneer known for his silver tongue and ability to charm money out of even the stingiest millionaire's pocket. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice boomed through the speakers, welcome to the highlight of our evening, the Children's Hope Foundation charity auction. Polite applause filled the room. Elizabeth watched as people straightened in their seats, ready to show off their wealth. She noticed Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte moving to a table closer to the stage, their faces glowing with anticipation. Our first item, James announced, is a week-long stay at a private villa in Tuscany, complete with a personal chef and wine tours. The bidding started at $10,000. Victoria immediately raised her paddle, her red dress catching the spotlight. Penelope quickly counted with $15,000. The two women went back and forth like it was a tennis match, each raise accompanied by a smug smile. $25,000. Victoria called out, flipping her blonde hair dramatically. $30,000. Penelope shut back, her diamonds sparkling. Finally, Victoria won with a bid of $35,000. She stood up and gave a little bow as people clapped, acting like she'd just won an Oscar instead of buying a vacation. The auction continued with more luxury items. Charlotte bid on a set of rare pearls that once belonged to a European princess. The bidding war between her and another socialite lasted 10 minutes, ending with Charlotte's victory at $75,000. Did you see that? Elizabeth heard someone whisper at the next table. The Bancrofts always have to have the best of everything. Each time one of the three women won an item, they made sure everyone noticed. They would stand, wave, and accept congratulations like they were doing the world's greatest favor by spending their money. Elizabeth watched it all quietly. She remembered when she and Thomas had saved for months just to take their daughter to the beach for a weekend. They had stayed in a tiny motel and eaten sandwiches on the sand, but their daughter had declared it the best vacation ever. And now, James announced with extra enthusiasm, we have something truly special. A painting by the renowned artist Alessandro Moretti, donated by the artist himself for our cause. A gasp went through the crowd as assistants unveiled a stunning landscape painting. Even Elizabeth, who knew little about art, could see it was beautiful. We'll start the bidding at $50,000. This time, all three women jumped into action. Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte began outbidding each other furiously. Their polite smiles had vanished, replaced by determined expressions. 60,000, Victoria called. 70,000, Penelope counted. 80,000, Charlotte raised. The room watched in fascination as the three socialites battled it out. Other guests whispered excitedly, some even placing side bets on who would win. 90,000. Victoria's voice was getting shrill. 95,000. Penelope shut back. 100,000. Charlotte declared triumphantly. The room erupted in applause. Charlotte stood up, beaming with pride. I just love supporting such a worthy cause, she announced loudly, making sure everyone heard her generosity. Throughout all this, Elizabeth noticed something interesting. The three women kept glancing her way, as if making sure she was watching their display of wealth. They wanted her to see how much money they could throw around without thinking twice. Victoria leaned over to her friends, speaking just loud enough for nearby tables to hear. This is what real charity looks like. Not everyone can afford to make a difference, of course. Penelope nodded. Some people probably think their little contributions matter. It's sweet, really. Elizabeth took a sip of her water, her face showing no emotion. She thought about the envelope in her purse and the surprise that was coming. These women thought charity was about showing off, about proving who had the most money to spare. They didn't understand that true giving comes from the heart, not from the desire to impress others. They didn't know that sometimes the quietest person in the room might have the biggest gift to give. As the auction wound down, James Whitmore smiled at the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, you've been extraordinarily generous tonight. But now comes the most important part of our evening, the direct donations to our research fund. Elizabeth felt her heart beat a little faster. The moment was coming, and nobody in this room had any idea what was about to happen. The crystal chandeliers seemed to shine even brighter as James Whitmore raised his hands to quiet the room. The auction had ended, and now came the part of the evening that truly mattered. The direct donations to the Children's Hope Foundation. Ladies and gentlemen, James announced, his voice warm with gratitude, your generosity during the auction has been remarkable. But now we come to the heart of our mission, direct contributions to our research fund. These donations go straight to finding cures for rare childhood diseases. Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. She touched the envelope in her purse one more time, making sure it was still there. Around her, people were already reaching for their checkbooks, eager to end the night with one final display of wealth. As is our tradition, James continued, we'll invite our guests to come forward and announce their pledges. Every dollar counts in our fight against these devastating diseases. Victoria was the first to stand. She smoothed her red designer gown and walked to the podium with the confidence of someone who knew all eyes were on her. The spotlight followed her every step. The Ashford Foundation is proud to donate $250,000, she announced, pausing for effect. The room filled with appreciative applause. Victoria smiled graciously, as if she'd just solved world hunger. As she returned to her seat, she made sure to walk past Elizabeth's table. That's how it's done, she whispered, loud enough for others to hear. Penelope went next, her diamonds catching the light as she approached the microphone. The Sterling Trust will contribute $300,000 to this wonderful cause. More applause, louder this time. Penelope shot a triumphant look at Victoria as she sat down. Charlotte wasn't about to be outdone. She practically floated to the podium, her designer gown rustling with each step. The Bancroft Family Foundation pledges $500,000, she declared, emphasizing each word. The room erupted in its biggest applause yet. People whispered excitedly about the impressive donations. Charlotte returned to her table like a queen returning to her throne, exchanging satisfied smiles with her friends. More donors followed, each announcing their contributions. 20,000 here, 50,000 there. The numbers blurred together, but everyone kept track of who gave what. In this world, generosity was a competition, and everyone wanted to win. Finally, after what seemed like hours, James looked around the room. Is there anyone else who would like to make a pledge tonight? Elizabeth's hand trembled slightly as she raised it. The room fell silent, and then the whispers started. Is she really going to? This should be interesting. What could she possibly donate? Victoria noticed first. She nudged Penelope and Charlotte, and all three turned to watch. Their faces wore identical expressions of amused contempt. Elizabeth stood slowly, aware of every eye in the room following her movement. Her simple navy dress felt like armor now, protecting her from their stares. She walked toward the podium with steady steps, her head held high. The whispers grew louder as she climbed the small steps to the stage. Someone actually laughed. Victoria's voice carried across the room. What's she going to donate? Her bus fare home? The laughter that followed was cruel and sharp. Elizabeth reached the microphone and adjusted it to her height. The room fell quiet again, but it was the silence of people waiting for a joke, not the respectful quiet given to other donors. James Whitmore, ever the professional, smiled kindly at her. "And what is your pledge tonight, madame?" Elizabeth looked out at the sea of faces. She saw Victoria smirking, Penelope covering her mouth to hide her giggles, and Charlotte rolling her eyes. She saw the other guests, all waiting to be entertained by whatever small amount this plain woman in the department store dress would offer. She thought about her daughter, about the doctors who had tried so hard but didn't have enough research to save her. She thought about Thomas, working 3 jobs to pay for treatments that ultimately failed. She thought about all the families going through the same heartbreak right now. Elizabeth opened her purse and took out the envelope. Her hands were steady now, her voice clear and strong as she leaned toward the microphone. The room held its breath, ready to laugh at whatever tiny donation was about to be announced. What happened next would change everything. Elizabeth stood at the microphone, the envelope in her hand feeling heavier than it should. The ballroom was so quiet she could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning. Every face was turned toward her, most wearing expressions of barely contained amusement. She took a deep breath and began to speak, her voice steady and clear. 20 years ago today, I lost my daughter to Pearson's syndrome, she said softly. The smirks began to fade from some faces. She was 8 years old, and she loved butterflies, chocolate ice cream, and bedtime stories. The room grew even quieter. Victoria shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The doctors told us there wasn't enough research to save her. Not enough funding, not enough hope. Elizabeth's voice remained calm, but her words carried weight. My husband and I spent everything we had trying to find a cure. We failed. She paused, looking directly at the 3 women who had tormented her all evening. They couldn't meet her gaze. Tonight, in memory of my daughter, I pledged $10 million to the Children's Hope Foundation for pediatric rare disease research. For a moment, nothing happened. The number seemed to hang in the air, too large to be real. Then someone gasped. A glass dropped somewhere in the back of the room, shattering against the marble floor. James Whitmore, the unflappable auctioneer, stood frozen with his mouth open. The entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. I'm sorry, James stammered, finding his voice. Did you say $10 million? Elizabeth nodded. Yes, $10 million. She pulled a certified check from her envelope and held it up. And I'd like to add another $5 million to establish the Lurley Morgan Memorial Wing at the Children's Hospital. The silence exploded into chaos. People jumped to their feet. Cameras flashed. Someone started applauding, and soon the entire room erupted in thunderous applause. But Elizabeth wasn't finished. She turned to face Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte. The 3 women sat frozen, their faces pale with shock. Elizabeth walked down from the podium and approached their table. Victoria, she said gently, reaching into her purse again, I believe I owe you for the dry cleaning. She pulled out another check and placed it on the table. This is for $5,000. I think that should cover it. Victoria stared at the check, then at Elizabeth, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. No words came out. The room had gone quiet again, everyone straining to hear what would happen next. Elizabeth looked at the three women who had spent the evening mocking her, and her expression held no anger, only a quiet dignity. "Ladies," she said, "I learned long ago that true wealth isn't measured by the label on your dress or the car you drive. It's measured by what you do with what you have and how you treat others along the way." Penelope's face had turned bright red. Charlotte was studying her champagne glass as if it held the secrets of the universe. Neither could look Elizabeth in the eye. James Whitmore had recovered enough to return to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice shaking with emotion, "this is the largest single donation in the history of the Children's Hope Foundation. Mrs. Morgan, would you please come back to the stage?" As Elizabeth walked back to the podium, the crowd parted like the Red Sea. People who had ignored her all evening now reached out to touch her arm, to offer words of thanks and admiration. Back at the microphone, Elizabeth spoke once more. "My daughter's favorite story was about a caterpillar who everyone thought was plain and ordinary. But inside, she was transforming into something beautiful." She smiled softly. "Sometimes the most extraordinary things come in the simplest packages." The crowd rose to their feet in a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. Tears flowed freely throughout the room. Even some of the waitstaff were wiping their eyes. Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte remained seated, their earlier arrogance replaced by shame. The $5,000 check sat untouched on their table, a reminder of how wrong they had been about the woman in the simple navy dress. As Elizabeth stood on the stage, bathed in applause and admiration, she touched the locket around her neck, the one containing her daughter's picture, and whispered, "This is for you, my butterfly." The next morning, Elizabeth woke up to find her phone filled with messages. The story of the humble librarian who had stunned high society with her $15 million donation had spread like wildfire. Every news channel wanted an interview. Every newspaper wanted her story. Local librarian Sile and CE's MILIONARDS wife at Rico read one headline. "The woman in DHE $30 dress UDAV-FIFTENMILION," proclaimed another. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in fame. She got dressed in her usual comfortable clothes, made her morning tea, and went to work at the library just like any other day. Children were waiting for story time, and Mrs. Henderson needed help finding a cookbook. The real storm was hitting Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte. Someone at the gala had recorded their cruel comments about Elizabeth on their phone. The video went viral overnight. People across the country watched in disgust as the three socialites mocked a grieving mother for her simple dress and humble appearance. Their social media accounts were flooded with angry comments. "Shame on you," wrote one person. "Money can't buy class," posted another. Sponsors began pulling out of their charity events. The embarrassment was complete when the video showed them laughing about Elizabeth's bus fare, just moments before she announced her historic donation. Victoria tried to do damage control. She posted a public apology, claiming she had been taken out of context. But the internet never forgets, and the video spoke for itself. Within a week, she had resigned from 3 charity boards. Penelope and Charlotte faced similar consequences. Their exclusive country club received so many complaints that the board had to take action. Both women were asked to take a temporary leave from club activities. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's donation was already making a difference. The Children's Hope Foundation hired new researchers and purchased advanced equipment. They started clinical trials for treatments that had been impossible before due to lack of funding. 6 months later, the foundation invited Elizabeth to visit their new research facility. She walked through labs where scientists were working on cures for rare childhood diseases. In one room, she met a little girl named Lucy who was receiving an experimental treatment made possible by her donation. "Thank you," Lucy's mother said, tears in her eyes. "They told us there was no hope before. Now look at her, she's getting better every day." Elizabeth hugged the woman, remembering her own desperate hope from 20 years ago. This was why she had given the money, not for recognition or praise, but for moments like this. The Children's Hope Foundation decided to rename their annual gala. It was now called the Elizabeth Morgan Compassion Award evening. They invited her back as the guest of honor for the next year's event. When Elizabeth arrived at the gala exactly 1 year later, she wore the same navy dress. It had become famous, the $35 dress that had witnessed the biggest charitable donation in the foundation's history. This time, when she walked into the ballroom, everyone stood and applauded. Victoria, Penelope, and Charlotte were notably absent from the guest list. In her speech that evening, Elizabeth spoke about the true meaning of charity. Giving isn't about showing off or competing with others, she said. It's about making a difference. It's about remembering that behind every statistic is a real person, a real family, hoping for a miracle. The research funded by Elizabeth's donation led to breakthrough treatments for several rare childhood diseases. Within 2 years, children who would have had no chance of survival were going home healthy. Each success story was a triumph not just for medicine, but for the power of genuine compassion. Elizabeth continued her quiet life as a librarian, still driving her old car and living in her modest home. But she had started a movement. People began to question the culture of performative charity. Donations to medical research increased across the country as others were inspired by her example. The navy dress now hangs in the Children's Hope Foundation Museum with a plaque that reads, "True wealth is measured not by what you wear, but by what you give." And somewhere, Elizabeth likes to think, her daughter is smiling, proud of the butterfly her mother became, transforming grief into hope and judgment into compassion, one donation at a time.